Bridgerton is a Netflix series that now has 2 seasons that's probably best described as being like a Jane Austen book, but hornier. Great emphasis is placed in this series on things like propriety, manners, and social class. You've got men who are rakes and who are gentlemen. You have women who are proper and who get to wear fancy dresses. It's all that Pride and Prejudice stuff that you might particularly enjoy, but then at the end, or in the middle, they get to bone. So it's, in many ways, the best of both worlds. It's a fun enough series, but there's something strange about it, which is that it's just so damn diverse. The Queen's black, the Duke's black, the new girl is brown, and you always see the characters in the background. They're going to be either brown, black, or Asian, right? It's a very multicultural sort of cast that they've got going on here in Bridgerton, which is odd, because I think this is supposed to be the early 19th century, right? It's supposed to be that old Jane Austen colonial Great Britain period, is it not? So what exactly is going on here? Now, Bridgerton is originally made by a woman named Julia Quinn. I haven't read the books myself, but my understanding is that the characters were all white in her original text. But when it came time to adapt Bridgerton to the Netflix series, the show essentially decided to change things up, right? This creator here said, it is a reimagined world, we're not a history lesson, it's not a documentary. What we're doing with the show is marrying history and fantasy in what I think is a very exciting way. One approach that we took to that is our approach to race. And you know what? Fair enough. I mean, I can see there are 2 sides of that particular argument. On one hand, you can't really minimize the colonialism part, nor can you just sort of ignore all of the nasty stuff that Britain and other European powers did all over the world. But at the same time, if you stick to historical accuracy, you're never going to have your Mr. Darcy played by a black guy. It's just not going to happen. So, whatever. They probably don't have any bad intentions by putting all the black actors in, so we can give it a pass. But what we can't give a pass to is how exactly the story is supposed to work. The explanation that the show gives is that Britain stopped being racist when the king married the queen, Queen Charlotte I think she is, and the queen was black and the king loved her so much that he decided, racism is wrong, and then the queen had power and she went ahead and appointed a bunch of black dukes and black everythings, and that essentially solved racism for this society forever. Well done, Queen. The problem with this explanation is that it makes no fucking sense. If you know your European history, this shouldn't come as a big surprise to you. King George of the Fifth was first cousins with Kaiser Wilhelm II before World War I, but guess what? There was still a World War I. White monarchs would marry each other all the time, but that didn't stop the countries from hating each other or going to war, or prevent prejudice or racism. They just married each other for political purposes, and then that was about it. So the idea of a black woman marrying a king and ending racism is a little silly. It's much easier for me to believe that you can prevent World War II by going back in time and killing Hitler than it is for me to believe that you could have prevented centuries of European anti-Semitism by convincing Severus of Minorca to marry a Jewish girl. So what exactly is happening in Bridgerton, then? Is it just that the creators didn't want to think about this aspect of the story too much? Well, yeah, of course that is. But, well, perhaps there's another explanation too. Jane Austen is about as white as it gets, but her fans are a lot less so. I've known white women that love Jane Austen for sure, but I've also known Latinas, Afghans, Pakistanis, Asians, you name it, and Jane Austen probably has a fan in that country. So she's got a bit of a global following. There's some sort of universal appeal, I think, in this idea of the society based on things like manners, propriety, social conventions, and all of that stuff that has a strange universal appeal. And so, regardless of the fact that this is a colonial piece of work, it's a colonial society, it still manages to get some hooks in people all around the world. And that's where perhaps we can find our explanation. Let's say I were to take a Jane Austen fan, and I were to simply shoot her in the face. Said fan would tragically die and be mourned by all her friends, and afterwards be welcomed into the arms of a loving God. Said God, wishing to right the injustices of the physical realm for this Jane Austen fan, would give her whatever she wanted. And what would she probably want? Well, the answer is Bridgerton. Bridgerton is essentially heaven for the Jane Austen fan. You get to have the dresses, you get to have the handsome rich men, you get to have the balls, you get to have the fancy music and the high class stuff and the propriety and all of that stuff. And you don't have to think about any of the colonialism or racism or slave trade that might have been occurring during the series' setting. So, that is, I think, what's actually happening. Everyone in Bridgerton is dead. Anthony's dead, the Duke's dead, Queen's dead, Kate's dead, Daphne's dead, Edwina is dead. Everyone is dead. And a merciful God has resurrected them and placed them in the paradise of paradise, the dream world that they always wished to inhabit during their mortal lives. When you put it into that context, the show stops being silly and starts to make sense. It's not meant to be our world or an alternative world. It's not an alternative history. What it is mercy. It's a world where God whispered to his chosen creation, you know what? Take a break from all this racism stuff. Breathe. Just, dance with this wonderful music. Put on fancy dresses. Be courted by ridiculously handsome men. And be at peace. And isn't that something to aspire to? Isn't it great to imagine a world where pretty women wear pretty dresses and fancy men wear ridiculous hats? Isn't that something wonderful? Isn't that something we should all strive for? And yes, that is what Bridgerton gives us. And all we have to do in order to get the very same thing is be shot in the face.